Hi, it's Dr. D. I'm going to share with you some ways in which you can have healthier conversations with your partner. But before I do that, I want to ask you just a few questions. Do you engage in circular conversations that go nowhere? Do you find that you're having the same conversation over and over again? Do you often lash out at your partner? Do you have a hard time listening to what they're saying, or maybe even remembering what they said? Do you have a tendency to check out while they're, lodging some complaints about the relationship? Do you find that a simple discussion can explode and become something much more complicated and volatile? If you answered yes to any of those questions, stay tuned. I'm going to offer up some ways in which you can engage in healthier conversations and get unstuck from that negative cycle. Now, before I get started, one of the things I really want to normalize is that most of us were not raised with healthy communication skills. And then what happens is if we don't really find a way to address that early on, we end up repeating those patterns through different relationships in our life. And then what we find is we have the same pattern of communicating with our partner. And so first, I want to normalize that most people do not have really good communication skills. And so they really want to learn how to do that. And I have found that oftentimes, by and large, but not always, men are the ones that have a tendency to distance, and women are the ones that have a tendency to pursue. So that the more that women pursue something and pursues a discussion, the more that man wants to distance himself. And oftentimes, the more that a woman pursues, the more that man feels emotionally flooded with all of her feelings and emotions, and the more they even distance himself even more, which kind of sets up this whole thing of a distancer-pursuer relationship. One of the key ways in which you can start to create a different type of conversation is to create what I would call a couples bubble. And a couples bubble is a safe space where both people feel they can go to their partner and talk about anything. And then in doing that, people feel safe that whatever they're going to bring up, they feel like their partner's going to be there to listen to them. They're going to be there to listen and validate and to hear what they have to say, because they both have agreed that they want to create a safe space in order to have these conversations. And that is the first step. Another thing that's really important to do is to create what I would call like a soft startup. And for me, how I frame a soft startup is asking your partner, is this a good time to talk? And if not, when? Because what happens is often we will go and start talking to our partner when we want to talk about something, but we really even ask them if they're in a good space to do that. And then often maybe because the partner doesn't want to put their partner off, they might have a tendency to start talking and say, okay, I'm going to engage in that conversation. But quickly they find out that they're really not in that good emotional state or a state of mind to have that conversation, and then things also implode very quickly. So a very important step is to ask, is this a good time to talk? And if not, when? Another important facet of having healthier conversations is to recognize your triggers, and we all have them. It could be a look, it could be something that they said or done, but we all have these triggers that come from somewhere. And the most important thing is to be able to identify what your triggers are and be able to manage them in a way. So if it's like something, how they're saying something, or their tone and inflection, or how they're behaving, all these things come up. And if we don't really identify them, then we actually end up bringing them into the conversation. And because these triggers are there and we're not really taking responsibility for them, then they're going to come up, and then we're going to actually react to that trigger. And so the goal is to identify what it is so that you can say, okay, let me verbalize what this trigger is, and let me share that with you so that when this starts to happen, I know how I can kind of calm myself down, so I can identify that, and we can maybe take a pause, and then we can restart again. Another really important part of effective communication is to have a plan. And the time to talk about that plan is when things are going well. Now, people don't want to bring up problems when things are going well. They feel like it's counterproductive, but actually it's really the best time to bring it up. Because if you don't, then you're trying to resolve something in the middle of an argument, and it's never going to happen. So the plan is you go back to having a soft startup, and when is this a good time, and talking about that safe space. And so the plan is to start there. And then when each person or one person starts to get really heated, then in order to control what I refer to as that lizard brain of ours, is that very old reptilian part of our brain that's very emotional. It's like, okay, let's take a time out. Let's come up with a plan that if one of us gets that way, we can take a time out. We can go to our corners, then we can come back in 15 or 20 minutes when cooler heads have prevailed, and then we can restart. And you want to be able to do that as many times as you need to keep that conversation going and healthy. Another thing to do to have healthier conversation is to be able to manage your own emotions, which coincides with what just previously mentioned about having a plan and controlling what I refer to as that lizard brain, right? Now, the lizard brain I talk about in therapy, it's because it's that very emotional part that everything starts there in that lizard brain. Everything is very emotional. In order to tap into that front of our brain, right, that prefrontal cortex for executive functioning and being able to manage our emotions and do all of those things that are more advanced, we have to calm ourselves down, calm that lizard brain down so that we can employ that part of our brain where there's rational thinking, executive functioning. So when we manage our own emotions, we're really like saying, okay, this is something that's triggering for me, this is something that's coming up for me, and how am I going to manage my emotions better? I can calm myself down, take some deep breaths, maybe walk away for a few minutes so I can come back and have a conversation that I feel better about with myself, and I feel like I'm more productive, or that you're more productive in these conversations, so you don't really feel like you're kind of going off the rails, which a lot of people often do. So calming that lizard brain is really important. Another important concept, or another important strategy in creating healthier conversations, is to have like a we attitude. And what I mean by we attitude is, you're not using that, you do this and you do that. It's really about, okay, how can we do better? How can we show up differently? What do we need to do as a couple that would allow us to feel better about this relationship and better about how we communicate? And so when you lean in and you're talking about those things with your partner, when they're not hearing, you're doing this wrong or you're doing that wrong, and then you start to say, okay, so if we really want to get better at this, how are we going to do better? Then each person really feels less defensive, right? They feel like we are in this together. We're trying to figure this out. We're not perfect. We have our issues. We have our triggers. We have these things that we're working through, but we can do this together. And that's really key. And lastly, one of the things I talk a lot about in therapy is just to have like what I would refer to as exploratory conversations, where you're not necessarily coming up with an end goal or a resolution right there, but ultimately you know that you want to. So maybe many of these issues that you have are not like one and done, but they're exploring this issue that's coming up. For example, if we were to communicate differently, like what would that look like? And if each of us were making a small change in that, what would that look like? And if we were going to explore how we reacted or responded to things previously, and we want to change that, what would that look like? And as each person is just like in this moment and having this conversation of just exploring how to get better at doing that, then there's a tendency to be more open and to share more things, because we go back to having that we attitude of, we're gonna figure this out together. And so we're going to explore ways in which we both can improve, improving how we feel about ourselves, but also how we feel about our relationship and being a couple. And I hope those help.